Good day. Great to be with you. Our topic for today is overcoming vainglory and deceit with transparency. Have you ever heard of resume padding? A fair number of years ago, I was provost of a university. A provost is a fancy name for someone who's the chief academic officer. So we had a candidate. He was strong in so many areas, and when I looked at his resume describing what he had accomplished so far in his academic career, it looked stellar. In fact, the resume stated that he had just published a great business book. And I thought, I haven't heard of this book before. And so what I did was I just went online and typed in the name of the book. No book. The book had never been published. The book had never been written. And so, sadly, the candidate came into my office and I said, I think we have a problem. And he said, what's that? And I said, I can't find your book. He looked extremely sad and nodded his head. And I, like provosts will sometimes say, I think we're going to have to move in a new direction. Resume padding. So what he was doing, bless his heart, what he was doing was trying to create an impression of being more accomplished, in his case, than he was. So here's what vainglory is. It's an old word. Some of us might not be familiar with it. Just look at the end of the word glory. So someone who possesses glory is someone who really is perhaps accomplished, an accomplished novelist, for example. My favorite is John Steinbeck. And Steinbeck was a great novelist, really. Someone who's troubled by vainglory is someone who's not a great novelist, but is pretending to be so. You might have vainglory operating in any number of circumstances. Just think of something from a Christian perspective. Someone who's suffering from vainglory has not yet reached the point where they're a good person. They might be moving towards that point, but they're pretending to be good. And what happens sooner or later is that lack of integrity catches up with somebody. People around the world, when they look at Christian folks, are disillusioned. Young people in the States today, for instance, are longing to run into people, not just Christian folk, they're longing to run into people whose lives ring true. There is a man who became a great desert father, but he started out, I think, struggling with vainglory. His name is Agrius of Pontus, and Agrius, late in the 4th century, was a rising superstar in the church, if I can put it that way. He was obviously gifted with words, probably 30 years old or so, relatively young, and yet when he would stand up in front of a group, he would impress bishops of the church with his ability to speak, to use words, to catch people's attention. But his character, Agrius' character, had not caught up with his gifting yet. There was a gap between the two. And so though he could speak very well, there was a problem with how he was living, this kind of disjunction that I've been talking about a bit. What happened? This is never a good idea in the Roman world. Agrius, it looks like, had an affair with a Roman procurator's wife, thinking he won't be caught out. And then he was informed that the Roman procurator knew. Now in the Roman world, that'll get you killed. So Agrius has to flee the capital of the Eastern Roman world, Constantinople, with a Roman procurator breathing down his neck in utter disgrace. Can you imagine? He gets on a ship, crosses the Mediterranean Sea, and ends up in Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, he meets a saint. Her name was Melania. And she runs across Agrius, and he introduces himself to her. He turns on the old bright personality, and she listens to his situation about which he did not tell her everything. And over time, they became friends. He started trusting her more and more, and she was a woman of great discernment. And to paraphrase, she basically says to Agrius, "Son, tell me the whole story. Tell me the whole story." And to his credit, he does. And he spends quite a few months with her in a convent for women she had established in Jerusalem. And she gets to know him well, and she sees this flaw in his personality, still the desire to be known, the desire to be famous, the desire to be recognized. And so she says to Agrius, if you can imagine, she says, "Agrius, I think the place for you is not Constantinople. The place for you is the desert." And he trusts her, this wonderful coach in his spiritual life. He trusts her enough, and he heads out into the desert. Nobody's going to recognize you in the desert because there's nobody out there to recognize you. You're largely by yourself. Imagine this young man, one of the rising celebrities in the Roman world, and now he finds himself in the Egyptian desert. To his credit, he stays there. He stays there year after year. At the beginning of his time in the desert, nobody knows who he is. Can you imagine as the days pass and the nights pass and the months pass, and he's out in this still, quiet environment, not being recognized by anybody, how hard that would have been for him? And yet what happened to him was he discovered something that's absolutely wonderful. I don't have to lie about who I am to create an impression on anybody. God loves me as his precious image bearer. God sees me, though nobody else sees me out here. And over time, as the years passed, Agrius started writing. And he would write what are called chapters. Not chapters in a book like when we think of a book. Just a chapter would be 2 or 3 sentences where he would comment on something he was learning in that very quiet space, that very lonely at times space. God was working on his character. God was growing his character. God was stretching his character. He was maturing as a human being. There's a tonal quality to his life and his words that is beautiful. And Agrius would write. He'd write these little chapters. Those chapters that he wrote are still in print today. So the person struggling with vainglory is going to end up having to lead a life of deceit. And leading that kind of life, that person, I would think, would be constantly worried someone's going to find out. I'm going to create somebody out here that people will be attracted to. They're going to like this person. I'm going to invest myself in this person. And they're going to really like him. They're going to like her. And that poor soul, at the end of the day, climbs into bed and thinks to himself, I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted because I've led a life of deception for the whole day, and I don't like that person. How can I get to a place where the person that I'm presenting to the world is the real thing? How can I, rather than being a deceptive person, be a transparent person, a vulnerable person? So think about these words with me. Think about the word genuineness. Genuineness. Think about the word authentic, authenticity. Don't you like to be with people like that? Someone who's not trying to create an impression, someone who seems to be at ease with who she is, with who he is, and you sense that transparency, that genuineness, that authenticity radiating out of that person. If I was doing this film series and was concerned about the impression I'm making on you, I'd be exhausted. By God's grace, I'm at a point in my life where I just figure, Chris, just do the best job you can do. And if it's all goes up in smoke, the French have an expression that they would use. They would say, c'est pas la fin du monde. C'est pas la fin du monde. It's not the end of the world. And I sense Christ saying to the person who's struggling with inauthenticity, vainglory, deceit, dear child, it's not the end of the world if you give that up. I did not create you to be that person. I created you to be you. And I love the real thing. So let me toss a few ideas at you that we can ponder together regarding how can we get to that place of freedom. The person who's entered into transparency, authenticity, is relaxed, calm. We don't have to create an impression on anybody. Let me toss 3 words that begin with S that helped Agrius in the desert. The first S is silence. Sometimes we just need to quiet down. The desert, a very quiet place. Sometimes we need to quiet down enough to allow the reality of who we really are to rise to the surface. Ponder that with me for just a moment. Sometimes we need to quiet down and allow the reality of who we are to rise to the surface. Let me add another S. Slow down. We're leading a life of such pace, such speed, that we never have the chance actually to discover who we are. It might well be, possible case, that we're doing all of these things at such a speed so that other people will look at us. I think this is true oftentimes in business circles in the States today. And the size of my calendar, if it's a packed calendar, other people in the business world will think, well, that's quite impressive. Packed calendar, moving fast, must be accomplishing a lot. I think the desert dwellers would say, not necessarily so. And finally, here's a surprising S. I think this is one of the best ones. It's the monastic virtue, the desert virtue of stability. Stability. What's stability? Stability is the willingness not to run when we begin to discover who we really are. We don't run. We stay in the same place. And we face with courage. We face what needs to be faced. Before God, we say, Lord, what I'm learning about myself is really hard. I never knew I was leading this inauthentic life. I never knew I was leading a life of deception, both deceiving myself and deceiving those around me. And the Lord says, it's all right. It's all right. I knew all of this about you. None of this is a surprise for me. I love you as the creature I've created you to be. And the most surprising things happen. Agrius, who thought he would just disappear in the desert, is still in print today. A final thought. So let me tell you about a good friend of mine, someone I've grown to love. His name is Charles de Foucauld. He was French. Charles de Foucauld, Catholic monk, asked his bishop, Bishop, I feel a call to move into the desert. And by God's grace, other brothers will hear I'm here and we'll build a community together. And his bishop said, I allow you to do so. And Charles headed out to what would be the Moroccan desert today. And he built a little house out there. He tried to help people around him there. And he waited. He waited for perhaps just one or two other brothers to sense this call to the desert. He waited all his life, and no one ever showed up. At the end of his life, he sensed his life was soon to come to a close. And sure enough, there was a misunderstanding. Some young guys showed up at his little hut, had rifles. One went off and killed Charles. Charles is buried. The hut comes down. Was this a life wasted? Nobody ever knew about him until they started reading his journal. And the more they read, the more the folks were entranced by what God had done in the life of this modern desert monk. There has been a line in that journal, which is in print today. I've got a copy in my office. There's a line that has helped me a lot. Pursue obscurity. Let this be an encouragement to you. This line is not for folks who've never been seen by their parents and feel that nobody has seen me, nobody's loved me. This is more a line for those folks tempted to vainglory, tempted to think I have to create an impression to be loved. I have to become famous to be worthwhile. And Charles would say, no, no, no. No, no, no. Pursue obscurity. How freeing. I see Charles, a desert monk, a modern desert monk, smiling and inviting us with a smile on his face to enter his world. A world of hope and love and freedom. What could be better? Blessings.